Conflict-related sexual violence remains one of the most devastating consequences of war in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. The United Nations says that hundreds of cases were documented last year in the provinces of North and South Kivu, affecting more than 1,500 victims, most of them women and girls. Human rights groups warn, though, that the real number is likely far higher because many survivors never report these crimes. Armed groups, militia, and even some government forces have been accused of using sexual violence as a weapon of war to terrorize communities and control territory. Well, to discuss what this tells us about the wider conflict and the challenge of protecting civilians, we're now joined by Professor Thomas Mandrup, who's an Associate Professor at the Royal Danish Defence College and also Extraordinary Associate Professor at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Prof. Always good to talk to you.
Good morning, Peter. Good morning to the listeners, and thank you for having me.
So the UN says that more than 1,500 victims were caught up in conflict-related sexual violence, and that they were documented last year in Eastern DRC. I guess questions then must be asked, what does it tell us about the current security situation on the ground in Eastern DRC in particular?
Yeah, but I think it both illustrates the complexities and the vulnerabilities and the fluidity of the situation at the ground at the moment, where there's a competition for control, a competition for loyalty and from the local population on the ground, and also that, for instance, the role that the United Nations mission in Congo, MONUSCO, has played previously, where the focus has, amongst other things, been on trying to prevent sexual violence, and especially sexual violence against children and protecting children and child soldiers and stuff like that. Due to the conflict with the M23 and the government forces, the Vasalendo and other militias, this work has been severely damaged by war, and it's unfortunately a pattern we see in especially in the DRC, but also in other conflicts, that the civilian population suffers when conflict happens and when there's complex conflict situations, but also that sexual violence used as you mentioned in your introduction, that as a tool of war, trying to secure the loyalty, or not loyalty, but that people do what the rebel forces or even the government forces want them to do.
So you mentioned this use of sexual violence. It's not just a byproduct of war often in these kinds of conflicts, and that it is a deliberate tactic. What would be the outcome? Why would they do this deliberately if it's not a byproduct?
Yeah, but I think there's many reasons for that. One is to force communities into submission. That's one thing. We have seen it being used, and it's well described in the literature, and I've seen it myself in the Congo as well. Trying to punish ethnic groups that maybe are often linked to other opposition forces. The whole story about trying to impregnate women from other communities to try to poison that line of ethnicity within these groups and all that. That is a well-documented element of this kind of conflict. Then there's, of course, the thing about being using women and or sometimes young girls as pastime for rebel forces is also very common, also for government forces. So there's many reasons for that, but I think you can put it into these maybe three main categories. And then, of course, there's also the other side to this, that women try to and people try to survive, and especially in very difficult circumstances. prostitution and other things are maybe is a way to secure food for your family, and so that's also part of that, and that would not be necessarily documented in this. And I think it's as you also mentioned in introduction, I think it's important to remember that these numbers are has a lot of doubt to them. Most likely the numbers are much higher because there's a lot of unreported incidences in this conflict in general in many ways.
And we believe that it's not just militia, that there could be government-aligned forces that are involved in this kind of sexual violence as well.
Yeah, and then again, it's a pattern we've seen. I was in the Congo the first time in 2004, and I remember I was a young man at that time, and then I was shocked. I was shocked by what I saw. I was in Manima province at that time, a town called Kindu, where the rebels my militia had just left the city, and then there was, yeah, it was a nightmare. It's like a bad old Vietnam movie in real life. So it's a pattern we've seen and all that, and that's also why that the UN has for a long time, as part of its UN mission, had where they try to address this. They try to go into dialogue with the government and with the government forces, with the militias, also the government-aligned militias, but especially also the rebel forces. They're trying to talk to them about child soldiers, sexual violence, these kind of things. The government forces for a long time has prided itself about that they had improved, the number of cases and the problems they've had in that area, and there was no longer impunity within our government's forces, and they would actually prosecute soldiers that transgressed the rules of engagement, and especially also issues like sexual violence and stuff like that. But what I've seen is that, again, is that when conflict happens and when we have a situation like we've had now and for a long time in Eastern DRC, with the war and the fighting, and especially also the government forces being on its back heels for a long time. We see these kind of the discipline decrease, and we see the problems amongst inside the forces being very increasingly a problem. So it's a well-documented problem, and it was not under control, but it had improved a bit. Of course, there was such much a focus on that, and then of course the resurfacing of violence and the large-scale violence, as we've seen in the Eastern DRC, has meant that these kind of structures and the ability of a possibility for the international community, where in form of the UN and its agencies to actually do something, is much less, and that's why we see this. Can we stop it? There needs to be a lot of international pressure, especially on the government forces, but also on M23 to try to have a focus on that. I think a report like this is a start, but there needs to be a lot of focus on and pressure on the leadership to try to change these incidences on the ground, because it's, again, the victims are the local population, and it's really, really sad, and it's a pattern we've seen over the many years of the conflict in the Eastern DRC.
So much of this violence is concentrated in North and South Kivu, where a lot of the M23 rebels have intensified their efforts. You've been watching this region for a long time now. Why is it that this part of the DRC has remained unstable despite all the international peacekeeping efforts?
Yeah, that's a big it's $1,000 question, eh? And it's a sad one, of course. But it's I think there's many incidents and many explanations to that. I think people on the ground are tired of war when you speak to them. Remember last time I was in the Congo, my interpreter, he spoke to him, and he said, and he was a bit younger than me, so in his 30s or 40s, he said, my generation is lost. We will never experience peace. My sons might, but maybe I can hope for my grandchildren not to experience war. So I think there's a fatigue in terms of war, and I've previously also said that this is an end game for what's going to happen in the Congo, because they're tired of war. But I think the problem here being that you've had this the whole reasons around regional interference, regional interests, who should control the Eastern DRC, that the whole story about Rwanda and Uganda and Burundi's involvement in the area. And the historic relations with that, we have the inter-ethnic divisions in the which cannot explain everything, but it's there. You have Kinyarwanda speaking both Hutu and Tutsis. You have Nande and others. So there's the whole thing about who has the right to land, issues that's not been addressed and solved. The whole concept of newcomers who are Kinyarwanda speaking people, as people that originated 150 years, maybe more back from Rwanda and Burundi, have their right to be in the Eastern DRC? Are their rights protected? You have greedy politician, corruption, trying to control concessions and mineral productions. So just to mention, you have local warlords trying to make a buck of this, not having ambitions to try to do all that, and then you have international layer on top of that, strategic international actors trying to also talk about resources, because that's a factor as well. So it's just there's no, and that what I'm trying to get at here is it's a very complex scenario, and what started the conflict originally back, whether it was the royal push from Rwanda after the genocide, so the reasons that started the conflict back in the day are very different today than they were many years ago. Some of the same, but it's a very complex picture.
Thomas, I wish we had so much more time, but we could talk for hours on this subject. But thanks so much indeed. Your insights always greatly appreciated. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's Professor Thomas Mandrup, Associate Professor at the Royal Danish Defence College and Extraordinary Associate Professor at Stellenbosch University here in South Africa. It's time for your news headlines. Here's Onele Nsinsi. Good morning.